from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Coming your way today during our first half hour, a visit with K-State's Gregg Ibendahl and Terry Griffin on their new analysis of what makes a top farm economically in Kansas. They ranked several hundred farms for their economic performance and then evaluated the importance of 5 factors to those rankings, including farm size, the level of debt, and the allocation of acreage to given crops. And they found some rather interesting trends, which Terry and Gregg will cover for us next. Later on, K-State's Charlie Lee in for his weekly stint, looking at another angle on backyard bird feeding and tying in the element of nest predation. Plus more ahead on this Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network, and welcome once more to another Agriculture Today. Well, here we're going to draw from a presentation that's being made later today, as well as tomorrow, at that pair of K-State Agricultural Lenders Conferences put on by the Agricultural Economics Department here at K-State. And the gentlemen who are joining us now put together this presentation that covers what makes a top farm in Kansas, economically speaking. Of course, that's a broad topic, and we'll try to narrow that down here with our guests, agricultural economists Gregg Ibendahl and Terry Griffin. Gregg, this write-up that you put together that you'll be presenting at the Agricultural Lenders Conference really stems from some inspirations from lenders and others in the past, right?
Yeah, last year I talked about ROA versus ROE for ratios to look at for farmers and how it's a bad thing if ROE... Yeah, I mean, it's a good thing if ROE is higher than ROA, but we talked about why ROA might be higher, and that's usually a case where either due to bad weather or maybe low crop prices where farmers aren't making enough money on their debt that they're borrowing to cover the cost of capital. So that's a bad situation if it goes on for many years. Now, 1 year thing could be explained by the weather or prices, but 3 or 4 years in a row, and we do have some farms in that situation, that's a bad situation. It's almost like going to the bank and, borrowing money and then putting it back in the savings account. You're not going to come out ahead on something like that. So one of the questions that came up with, well, what actually makes a farm, better than another farm? Can we actually tell what are the characteristics that define that? So that was kind of the motivation for doing this research in the first place. ROA,
return on assets, ROE, return on equity. That's the terminology you're referring to there. But Terry, you and Gregg have been hammering away at this. This report is a culmination of several phases of analysis that you've been running, right?
It has been, Eric. So Gregg and I have been uploading fact sheets to agmanager.info for the last 6-8 months. And we started with some fairly simple questions about how does farm size, how does acreage impact net farm income per acre, and then we started looking at specific crops, and as Gregg just mentioned, return on equity and return on assets, and been finding a pretty interesting story. As we've uploaded to Ag Manager, we've also shared these on social media and had some interaction with producers online who debated with us a little bit, and also some of them decided to give us some affirmation, saying, this is what we're seeing. In the case of farm size, it was one of the refreshing things was not always adding acres makes a farm more profitable, and that was one of the outcomes early on.
Well, to expand on all of that, but how you tried to put this together, Gregg, was you looked at Kansas Farm Management Association data over 10 years' time, and in essence, ranked farms on the basis of their incomes. How did you get at this exactly?
Well, looking at just a 1 year set of data, again, weather and prices can have a big difference in whether a farm's profitable or not. Maybe just kind of struck it lucky with your marketing, you had a really good year. So by you looking at a 10-year horizon and keeping the same farms in there that entire time, and then also using a ranking procedure as opposed to just looking at net dollars on returns, it kind of made a fair comparison, because if you were the consistently a good farmer and ranking in the top 5 or 10% of the rankings every year, that really said that you were doing something better than your competing farmers. In the same way on the low end, what we did find out though, that if you were in the middle somewhere, that could be a combination of you were either consistently in the middle every year, but more than likely probably was the case where you had one good year, maybe one bad year, and you tend to average out somewhere in the middle here. So by using rankings in a 10-year history, I think we got around a lot of the things that could just cause a 1-year variation.
And in going about this ranking, Terry, you and Gregg focused on net farm income, but to try to even the playing field, if you will, you looked at this net farm income by acre, correct?
That is correct. So regardless of farm size, we're looking at this as net farm income on each acre on average. And that helps to remove some of the disparities if we're trying to compare a 2,000-acre farm versus a 10,000-acre farm. And we do know that there are differences in ability to buy inputs and machinery and allocating those across larger acreage.
Right. And you then looked at almost 400 farms, and you ranked them, but you looked at them within a region, as you said, Gregg, and then you have these rankings in hand. What do you do with those rankings from there forward to identify top farms?
Well, then we get a ranking every year, and then we basically just average that 10 years of history for the rankings and kind of get an overall average ranking then to determine which is kind of the best set of farms and which is the middle set and which is the bottom set.
And once you have the rankings, you attach certain factors to those. It's sort of a cross-reference here, Terry.
Yes. So one of the things now that I'm trying to get across to producers I'm talking with, there's a lot of stress people have right now. Mm-hmm. Stress is caused by low commodity prices. The weather in 2019 was not what anyone anticipated. Lots of different stresses out there. And one of the points, I think, from this study and some of our other studies is that, this is where majority of the people are. This is how you can compare yourself to the majority. And the reason is a lot of farms, I think, were putting more pressure on themselves than they really needed to. They felt like they were being outliers, or they were being left out, or their ratios weren't where they should. Well, comparing benchmarking to their cohort is a way, I think, it relieves stress for a lot of farmers. Now, that being said, there are some farms who are below the curve who, I just reiterate that they are dealing with some really serious financial issues.
Right. So you take, for example, farm size, and then you relate that to these rankings. And, Gregg, this is kind of back to what Terry was saying, whether farm size makes the difference in terms of one's ranking. But where does farm size rate in these rankings?
Well, that was probably one of our surprising results, because I kind of expected the bigger farms to be more efficient. Like as Terry mentioned, having ability to buy inputs at lower prices and maybe better marketing opportunities as well here. But really, based on the farm size that we have in our KFMA database, there's really no advantage to being a bigger farm. I think we have caught farms that stay in our program, especially if they've been in there for 10 years. Those farms are probably already at an efficient size to start with, so we didn't really see an advantage to the farm size.
And the farm sizes that were in our data set were almost 1,000 acres up to almost 4,000 acres.
That would probably be the majority, yes.
So there weren't huge, the largest farms in the state were not part of this.
You're not talking 30 to 40,000 acre operations.
These are, I would call them single equipment set farms. They typically would probably have one harvester, one planter, or possibly a grain drill. Single equipment set farms.
The debt level was also something that you looked at. How did you factor that in here?
So debt to asset is one of the standard ratios, if there is a standard that we discuss, especially with lending, the amount of debt relative to the amount of assets on the farm. So zero would be there's no debt on the farm, which would be almost a lot of times is what a lot of people strive for. But when it's greater than zero, there are debt. And as that number increases, more debt relative to the assets. So when we looked at the analysis, we compared this for East, Central, and West Kansas and got distinct differences. And we also compared this by generation, which I'm not sure we'll talk about today.
Something we visited about in
we
the
visited
previous
about last time.
session. Right.
And as the baby boomers tended to have less debt than millennials and so forth, mainly because millennials were younger and been farming for less time.
But when you look at the debt levels, does that speak loudly in regard to the rankings of these farms?
Yeah, that was a significant factor. It was. So the higher your debt level was, the lower you tended to rank as far as the ranking was concerned, which to me says is when you relate that back to farm size, I don't think farmers should be looking at the fact that they really need to expand aggressively because, I mean, if you're already at a certain size, just getting bigger is really not going to help you, but adding more debt is really going to be a detriment to your net farm income.
Other things you looked at here, machinery investment and machinery cost. We'll talk about those independently, but those are not one and the same.
And those are two different variables in the KFMA data set.
Machinery investment is basically looking at the total asset value of your machinery divided across all your crop acres, so you get a value per acre. The machinery cost number is basically looking at depreciation costs, but you're also looking at all the operating costs in there together. So there might be some correlation with the fact that you would, if you did have higher machinery investment, you might have higher machinery costs, but they're not necessarily all related, though. I mean, if you have newer machinery, that would tend to lower your machinery cost from operating expenses and vice versa here. So they're definitely different concepts.
Really, Terry, this is right in your wheelhouse as a precision agriculture economist. We'll get to that shortly, but we need to break away for a moment. Again, what we're discussing with our guests, an analysis of what makes a top farm in Kansas in the economic sense. Terry Griffin and Gregg Ibendahl of K-State alongside. They took this 10-year view of grain farms in the state, utilizing Kansas Farm Management Association data in 3 regions of Kansas, eastern, central, and western Kansas, ranking nearly 400 farms on their net farm income per acre, and then averaging those 10 years of farm rankings to come up with an overall ranking, and then looking at all of these variables to see how they figure into that ranking. We'll cover more on this with Terry and Gregg when we return here on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
We're back now on Agriculture Today. Once more, a conversation with K-State agricultural economists Gregg Ibendahl and Terry Griffin here. They are the authors of a new analysis of the top farms in Kansas, economically speaking, drawn from Kansas Farm Management Association data and presented at the aforementioned agricultural lenders conferences that K-State is hosting this week. When we left off, Terry, we were talking about 2 of those variables tied into these rankings of Kansas farms as far as their returns, and looking at machinery investment and how that would play into those rankings. You might tell us what you and Gregg found there.
Sure. Machinery investment was one of the significant variables, and as machinery investment increased, rankings became more favorable. Okay, so farms that had more invested in machinery beforehand had higher rankings. And if we apply this to the agricultural technology issues that we've been evaluating, a similar story has emerged. And we looked at the debt-to-asset ratio not after the investment, but prior to the investment in ag technology. And we found out that people who invested in automated guidance, shield monitors, had already higher debt-to-asset ratios than non-adopters. They were already more leveraged. And I think that kind of gives us an indication of the type of operators that they are. They're definitely not a risk-averse operator, and we can think about it from a risk perspective. And here's the same way. Farmers who had higher investments in machinery were ranked as more profitable farms over the long haul.
Yeah, that's a little bit surprising, though, because normally you would think extra machinery would be a drag on profitability, but it's really not. I really think what we're seeing with those results, though, is more of not a cause, but actually an effect from what is happening. I think farmers are using machinery as a cash flow tool. So whenever they do have really good years, they tend to take those extra profits and invest in more machinery as a way to hold down their taxes. So the fact that they had more machinery probably is an effect of having actually higher profits. And as Terry said, it could also be a technology thing, too. Maybe the better producers do have better and newer technologies that they're taking advantage of, and it's making their machinery investment higher.
If we dug into it, we probably found out that farms that had more invested in machinery may be more efficient, being able to plant and harvest more timely. But as of right now, we've not tested the hypothesis of were more profitable farmers investing more in machinery, or did the machinery investment lead to more profitability?
That might be fodder for further analysis.
Yeah, that'd be a great master's or thesis project for some student here at K-State, by the way.
But you, again, distinguish between machinery investment and machinery cost, and that would be the cost of operation, cost of maintenance, and so forth?
Yes. So it tells a similar story. Machinery cost was flatter, though, almost.
Yeah, it's not really significant.
It's not even significant. So as machinery cost increases, no relationship with how the farm ranked with net farm income per acre.
But that doesn't say that cost management on the machinery side should be ignored here by any stretch, does it?
Definitely. Any of these variables we're talking about, we're looking at the margin. We're looking at efficient farms who've been farming for at least 10 years. So these are successful farms who are farming efficiently. Any of these variables we've been talking about, everybody in the back of their mind who's listening to this right now are thinking about a farm who's thinking, this farm has extreme capital investment. They're over-equipped, or, this or that, and can think of some examples that would fall as outliers on our analysis. So I think the listeners need to keep in mind that we're talking about farms who are successful, they're efficient, they've been in operation for at least a decade.
Yeah, as Terry mentioned, so the 50 percentile for machinery investment for the eastern Kansas would be about $300 of machinery per acre. That's only at the medium. So, we got farms in Kansas in eastern Kansas have $500 or $600 machinery per acre, too. So there's quite a range in how much people have.
The last factor that you plugged in here, it's called acreage allocation. Explain the thought process.
Well, so we kind of looked at how producers are allocating their crop acreage base they do have and what their mix of crops is, and looking at how farmers do that, and if farmers have a higher percent of like corn, wheat, or soybeans, what we were looking at to see if that actually affected their profitability per acre. And that was a little bit surprising because it did show that especially having more corn was highly beneficial to farmers, especially in kind of those areas that are kind of marginal for maybe growing corn like central Kansas. And the kind of the opposite effect with wheat. More wheat would tend to be a detriment. Now, we got to keep in mind, though, that I don't want to get myself in trouble with the wheat growers here, but this is based on a specific 10-year period that we looked at here. So I don't think you could necessarily make these generalizations forward for what might happen. But on the 10 years that we did analyze, this is kind of what we saw.
And keep in mind, too, that we're not talking about going to 100% corn acres either. So in the data set, about 65% was the highest corn allocation that we saw in any farm, meaning that out of 1,000 acres, only 650 were allocated to corn. So we didn't have anything that was in the 90%, 95%, and definitely not 100%. So
crop diversification remains valuable, still, risk management, etc.
Exactly, and for rotational concerns and so forth. So that's important to keep in mind.
So you pull all of this together and you come up with a handful of things that may truly influence where a farm would rank over this scale of profitability over time, in this case 10 years. So what do you draw from this that producers could look at and tangibly say that this is an adjustment that individual could make to improve their lot, so to speak, economically?
Well, I would have to say, we certainly haven't looked at all the factors, first of all, so I'm sure there's some things in there we haven't even discovered yet. But I guess the surprising thing that I've seen so far is that, once you get to a certain size, I'm not sure there's a whole lot of advantage to becoming bigger than that. To me, I think it's more important to kind of keep your debt in check. I mean, we're seeing this even with interest rates kind of low. I think that the situation was where we had a lot of higher interest rates. I think that debt thing would stick out even more than what it does here. And then machinery is not that big of a drag. So I think the fact that farmers are using that as a cash management strategy may outweigh the fact that there may be some extra cost in there with having more machinery. So the machinery thing, I don't get too concerned now if I see some farmer that has extra machinery, because they can almost use that as a machinery bank. When times are tough like they are now, they can draw into that and not have to buy machinery, whereas, if you were following a replace as something wore out, you'd have to be buying machinery now when cash flow is kind of tight. So I think that's the way farmers are looking at the cash flow thing.
Terry, your perspective?
Yeah, so keep in mind that this is a simplistic analysis, one variable at a time, which is not necessarily realistic because, as we know, all the variables play together at the same time. But to make it digestible, we looked at one variable at a time. And I think the takeaway here is it'd be a good, quick benchmarking for growers to see how they compare. And hopefully they'll realize that maybe not that different than the average and above average farms.
Now, and you mentioned this, and we'll close on this, you have more variables you want to explore, such as?
Lots of variables. So, Gregg's been looking at financial ratios and proportion of crop in the mix allocated across the whole farm. We've got a stack of variables and may include technology. How does the adoption of section control impact profitability rankings as well? But we can just go on and on about that.
Yeah, and Terry's also hit on he's been leading the analysis on this age generation thing, and we've got some interesting papers about too, and I think that can explain some of these top farmer issues we're seeing too.
Crop insurance, that may be something you want to tie into this at some point.
Yeah, and we're looking at crop insurance as a proxy for risk aversion. Those who invest more in crop insurance, we're using that to see how risk impacts these decisions.
Mm-hmm. Capital management. I mean, the list could go on and on. Yeah. Well, looking forward to the fruits of that future labor as you utilize the Kansas Farm Management Association data in new and innovative ways. You are presenting this at the Agricultural Lenders Conferences, but, Gregg, this very information is summarized in an article now on the agmanager.info website.
Well, there's actually a series of papers out there, so that would probably be the best place to find those.
Very good.
They're online on agmanager.info. All this information is, and we tested this a few times. We're presented at with our own colleagues at the Triennial Farm Management Conference.
And to our KFMA economists, too.
And to the KFMA economist. So it had a really good discussion at both. And we got some really good insights and feedback. And a lot of our interpretation has improved over time. And so it's not too late to come out to the Ag Lenders Conference tomorrow and see what Gregg has to say.
Mm-hmm. And just one last thought. You both welcome feedback from agricultural producers as they take a look at this data and sort through what it might say to their situation. Right?
Definitely. We'd love to hear from producers about why they do things and help us to get better insights into the behavior of farmers as they're optimizing their decision process.
Well, this does shed some unique light on what makes a top farm economically in Kansas. Great analysis, and thanks to the both of you for summarizing it for us right here. We'll talk again soon.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Eric. It's great to be here.
Along with us, agricultural economists Gregg Ibendahl and Terry Griffin. Again, they put together this analysis that's available on agmanager.info if you'd like to go look at it for yourself. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and more is coming your way after these moments aside here on the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today returns now, as does our regular Tuesday guest, Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, for another look at wildlife management. Charlie, we have more on this theme of the impact of bird feeding on wildlife other than the birds one's attempting to attract, and this time the influence on predators in those bird feeding areas.
We do know that the abundance of foods that are provided by humans provides an excellent opportunity to look at what those impacts of food provides to wildlife communities. We know that they can change animal behavior. They can change population dynamics. Supplementary food can influence the species relationships. But there's really not been a lot of research that's looked at bird feeding and how many predators are impacted as a result of communities feeding birds. We do know that sometimes supplementary food is provided intentionally. Sometimes that food is unintentional. That could be some things like compost piles, refuge left out, not disposing of farm vegetables properly. All of those things are unintentional impacts, but bird feeding has a direct impact. And this was a particular study that was done in Columbus, Ohio, to look at the impacts of bird feeders amongst predators and their prey species.
So this study concentrated on what predatory species then?
Well, they looked at diurnal predators, American crows, brown-headed cowbirds, gray squirrels, blue jays, common grackles, and domestic cats. Those were predators that are commonly found around urban communities, in backyards. All of those species incorporate human-provided foods, including birdseed from feeders, and are commonly found in suburban neighborhoods. The two target species of birds that they were looking to see what those impacts were American robins and cardinals. Both of those are commonly found in backyards. Cardinals would use feeders, but robins are seldom going to be using the feeder directly.
So did those conducting this study basically set up a monitoring system to observe directly the behavior of those predators around the nesting areas of those two birds?
Yes, they conducted the research in 7 residential neighborhoods, each of about 8 acres in size. Those neighborhoods were next to riparian forest parks, where other long-term research had been going on. Very similar in composition with building density and landscape composition. They looked at approximately 150 to 175 yards each of 3 years, with about up to 30 yards per neighborhood, which was about 50% of the area in each of the neighborhoods. So they visited each neighborhood twice a week between dawn and 4 p.m., and then they used additional visits as necessary as the birds became closer to fledging. So they attempted to find every robin and cardinal nest within that 8-acre area of each neighborhood by systematically searching each of those neighborhood areas.
So what results did they come up with on the effects of those predatory species? Were they consistent? Were they variable? What?
Well, they found that the effects of the bird feeders, it varied among the predator and the prey species. Bird feeders were positively associated with the relative abundance of American crows and brown-headed cowbirds. Now, the impact of brown-headed cowbirds is not just parasitism. That's not what they looked at. This was brown-headed cowbirds actually consuming eggs or destroying eggs in the nest. Neighborhoods with at least 15 feeders had on average 2.7 times more crows and 3.2 times more cowbirds than neighborhoods with 3 or fewer feeders. So that tells me that certainly these bird feeders are attracting species that are also common predators in the area. But when they looked further, the relationships among bird feeders and predators and nest survival, it was pretty complex. Nest survival of the robins declined with increasing numbers of bird feeders, only where the crows were most frequently detected. In neighborhoods with the most bird feeders and crows, fewer than 1% of the robin nests were expected to survive to fledgling, while in neighborhoods with fewer feeders and fewer crows, up to 34% of the robin nests were expected to successfully fledge young. But when you looked at the survival rates of cardinals, they weren't really related to either feeders or to the predators. So the conclusion was that bird feeders generally do not promote nest predation, but there's probably some subtle nuances there that need further examination. And I think, to me, one of the more surprising things was that domestic cats did not seem to be positively correlated with the presence and the number of bird feeders. I've often told people when they're feeding birds that they're not just feeding birds, they're feeding an entire animal community. And some of those animals are certainly predators.
And further, you say there were other predatory species that were not examined at all in this study, and they would have to, in the real world, be accounted for as well.
Well, I think conducting the survey at other times than solely during the daylight hours would be important. Some of the best-known nest predators would be raccoons and opossums, so I think the study probably could be continued and include those nighttime predators, and perhaps then we would see some more explicit results. Bird feeding is still a very popular activity, and I think we need to continue to promote its use. Just keep in mind that bird feeders have a sort of a complex relationship, and everything we do as humans can change the wildlife community as well.
That's a quick review of a new study out of Ohio. Again, it looked at the influence of bird feeding on predatory species. Charlie, many thanks. Charlie Lee, with that word, he's a wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Our time is away for today. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.